It was supposed to be just another ordinary afternoon at the grocery store. Aisles full of chatter, carts rattling against linoleum, and checkout lines crawling forward with the patience only routine can bring. No one noticed when he first walked in. A man well past 70, clothes worn and weathered, his gait slow but deliberate. He held only a few items in his hands: bread, milk, and a small tin of soup. Things that seemed modest until the moment everything changed. When he reached the counter, the cashier didn't even look him in the eye. She scanned his items with a sigh heavy enough to make the people behind him shift uncomfortably. Then came the question, quiet, almost apologetic. "Do you accept coins?" He opened his palm, revealing a small pile of change, counted carefully. That's when her tone shifted, sharp, dismissive. "We don't have time for this," she muttered, pushing the items aside. "Next." The man stood still, confusion etched across his face. His hands trembled slightly, not out of anger, but something worse. Shame, the kind that makes your spine feel too heavy. People watched, some whispering, some pretending not to. But no one moved. Not until the store manager appeared, drawn by the tension, unaware that his own life was about to crack open in front of an entire line of strangers. As he approached the register, his eyes fell on the old man, and for a heartbeat, he couldn't breathe. The items, the coins, the face. Something collided in his chest like a forgotten memory, breaking the surface. Then, without hesitation, he stepped between the cashier and the customer, and what he said next left everyone in line frozen. But it wasn't his words that stunned them. It was the moment he broke down, right there, in front of his staff and customers, tears streaming as he took the elderly man's hand and whispered something no one expected. This wasn't about customer service. It wasn't about store policy. It was about something much deeper, a past long buried, a connection long lost, and a truth that had been waiting, quietly, for the right moment to return. And as it did, every single person in that store witnessed something that couldn't be unseen. The manager's name was Daniel. He was in his late 30s, known for his calm demeanor and sharp work ethic. To his employees, he was professional, firm, but fair. He didn't lose his temper, and he didn't get emotional. But when he reached the register that day, something in him cracked. The moment his eyes met the elderly man's face, he stopped cold. He didn't say a word at first. He just stared, not at the groceries, not at the coins, but at the man's eyes. Eyes he somehow knew. The cashier, still standing with arms crossed, said under her breath, "He's trying to pay in coins." I told him it's against policy. Daniel didn't respond to her. He took a step forward and slowly knelt beside the man, who had begun to back away, clutching his small collection of coins. "Sir," Daniel said, his voice catching, "what's your name?" The man hesitated. "Frank," he whispered. "Just Frank." And that's when Daniel's hands started to tremble. He reached into his pocket, pulled out his own wallet, and quietly paid for the items. "You don't have to," Frank said softly. But Daniel was already placing the groceries back into the old man's arms. Then came the moment no one in the store could have predicted. Daniel broke down. Right there, in front of customers and staff. Tears streamed down his face as he gently held Frank's shoulder. You don't remember me, do you?" Frank looked puzzled. He blinked, squinting as if trying to place a face long blurred by time. "Should I?" he asked carefully. Daniel nodded slowly. "You used to bring sandwiches to the boys at the orphanage. Every Thursday. You wore that same jacket." Frank looked down at his coat. Worn corduroy, patches at the elbows. He didn't speak. His lips parted, then closed again. The moment hung in the air like a held breath. And then, softly, that was a long time ago, the silence in the store shifted. No longer awkward or confused, but reverent. Shoppers who had once looked away now stood still, witnesses to a reunion that had waited decades to happen. Because Frank, forgotten, dismissed, overlooked, had once done something small for someone who never forgot. And now, that someone had grown into a man who finally had the chance to say thank you. Frank's hands trembled slightly as he held the grocery bag Daniel had just filled. His knuckles were thin, skin like paper, and he clutched the bag as if afraid it might vanish. "I didn't think anyone remembered that," he said. His voice cracked, not from age, but from something deeper, a kind of disbelief that kindness, once given and forgotten, had somehow come back full circle. Most people thought it didn't matter. Daniel stood, wiping his eyes with the back of his sleeve. It mattered, he said. It mattered more than you could imagine. The cashier had gone silent, her arms now hanging at her sides, face pale. She didn't look at Daniel or Frank. Instead, she stared at the counter, ashamed. Customers in line began setting their items down more gently. No one was in a rush anymore. The room felt sacred, like a church holding a sermon written in real time. Frank slowly sat on the bench near the window. He looked overwhelmed, like the weight of the moment had hit harder than any burden he carried into that store. Daniel sat beside him. "Do you know why I became a manager here?" he asked, voice low. "Because I used to come into this store when I was 16, and they would chase me out. I thought I'd never be respected. But I remembered how you treated us, like we were worth your time. I wanted to build a place that did that, too." Frank's eyes filled. He looked down at his weathered shoes, then out the window, where a group of pigeons gathered around the edge of the parking lot. "I used to feed them, too," he said with a smile. "At the park. Little crumbs from my pocket. I guess I never did anything big." Daniel turned to him. "You did the most important thing. You stayed kind, even when the world stopped noticing." And in that simple exchange, between a man who had given and forgotten, and a boy who had received and remembered, something extraordinary unfolded. The store no longer felt like a place of business. It felt like a place of belonging, a space where time bent long enough for gratitude to catch up with history. And no one who stood there that day would ever see kindness the same way again. Word of what happened began to spread, but not through headlines or social media. It moved more quietly, passed between customers, staff, and strangers who happened to be there that day. People didn't talk about the coins or the cashier. They talked about the look on Daniel's face when he recognized Frank. The rawness of that moment. The way silence fell over the entire store, not from awkwardness, but from awe. It was the kind of silence that happens when people witness something holy, though no one says it out loud. The next day, Frank returned. Not to shop. He came with a small brown envelope and asked if Daniel was working. When they brought him out, Frank handed over the envelope and said, "This isn't much, but it's for the groceries." Daniel gently pushed it back. "You already paid for them. Years ago. With sandwiches. With time. With showing up when no one else did." Frank smiled, his eyes wet. "Then maybe you'll let me pay it forward to someone else." And so, Daniel and Frank came up with an idea. Quiet, simple, but powerful. They created a small wooden box to sit beside the register with a handwritten label. "For the ones we've forgotten." No marketing. No explanation. Just a place for people to drop spare change, or even a note. Within a week, the box was full. Not just of coins, but folded slips of paper with words like, "For my father, because someone once helped me, in memory of Ruth." Employees began to take notice. The cashier who had turned Frank away asked Daniel if she could speak to him. Her voice was soft, remorseful. "I didn't see him," she said. I looked at him, but I didn't see him. I was tired, stressed, distracted." "That's no excuse." Daniel nodded, not with blame, but with understanding. "It's never too late to start seeing people," he said. "You just have to choose to slow down long enough to care." From that day on, something in her changed. She greeted each customer with a little more patience, asked how their day was, smiled even when she was exhausted. And each time Frank walked in, she offered a warm hello, "Mr. Frank," as if making up for 1,000 moments where someone like him might have been ignored. And Frank, in return, gave her a smile that said, "I forgive you." Because that's what kindness does. It doesn't keep score. It just keeps giving. Frank started coming more often, not to buy groceries, but to sit on the bench near the front window. Some days he brought a book. Other days he simply watched people come and go, nodding at the children, waving at older shoppers. It wasn't long before others began sitting with him. Some regulars, some new faces. They'd chat, laugh, even cry. The bench became more than a resting place. It became a kind of altar, a quiet sanctuary in the middle of the store. One afternoon, a young boy named Leo approached Frank. He couldn't have been more than 8. He held a toy car in one hand and a crumpled dollar bill in the other. "My mom says you're the nicest man here," he said, "even though you don't work here." Frank chuckled. "That's kind of her." Leo climbed up beside him. "I want to be nice, too. Can you show me how?" Frank nodded, tears pricking his eyes. Start by seeing people, really seeing them, especially when they look like they've been forgotten. That evening, Daniel sat with Frank and asked if he remembered all the sandwiches he used to bring. Some, Frank said. Not all. I never knew if they really made a difference. Daniel looked him in the eyes. They did. We had nothing. But when you came, we had someone. Frank was quiet for a moment. Then he said, funny, isn't it? I always thought I didn't have much to give. But maybe it's not about how much. Maybe it's about whether or not you show up. The ones we've forgotten box began to change, too. Some people left dollar bills. Others left notes to family members who had passed away, or apologies to strangers they never had the courage to speak to. A woman left a wedding ring with a letter that said, he would have liked this place. And Daniel, who once thought his job was just about keeping a store running, realized that somewhere along the way, his store had become a place of memory. And in that space, between grocery aisles and checkout lines, between strangers and second chances, a quiet kind of healing took root. All because one man, with a handful of coins and a forgotten face, was finally seen. Frank never asked for attention, and he certainly didn't expect it. But something about the way he carried himself, the gentleness in his eyes, the way he paused before answering, the sincerity in every word, made people gravitate toward him. He didn't try to fix anyone. He just listened. And in a world that rarely slows down, that became his greatest gift. People began sharing things they hadn't said in years. Small heartbreaks, quiet hopes, stories that had waited a lifetime for a place to land. One day, a woman named Karen sat beside Frank on the bench. She held a bouquet of white lilies wrapped in yesterday's newspaper. They were my mother's favorite, she said. She passed 2 weeks ago. I keep forgetting she's gone until I see her favorite things. Frank nodded. Grief does that. It doesn't shout. It just lingers. Karen looked down at the flowers and said, I didn't know where else to take them. But then I remembered this bench. It feels safe here. Frank didn't say much. He just took one flower from her hand and placed it gently on the little table beside them. Then let this be your place too, he said. The next day, more flowers appeared. A few days later, a small photo frame. No signs, no instructions, just memories finding a home. That corner of the store, once unnoticed, had quietly become sacred ground. And somehow, everyone who entered seemed to know it. Daniel watched all of this with quiet awe. He had opened this store with the hope of making something better. But what had happened with Frank was never part of a business plan. It was something deeper, organic, human, holy. He doesn't just make people feel welcome, he told one of the employees. He makes them feel seen. There's a difference. And the employee replied, he made me want to stay. I was going to quit next week. But now, I feel like this place matters. One evening, as the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the floor, Daniel sat beside Frank and asked, what do you think all this is? Frank looked around at the candles, the notes, the strangers smiling at each other across aisles. I think, he said, this is what happens when kindness lives long enough to grow roots. And Daniel knew then, it had never been about the groceries. It had always been about presence. The kind that changes people, one small act at a time. It wasn't long before the bench by the window was given a name, though not an official one. People began calling it Frank's bench. Someone carved the name into a small piece of wood and placed it beneath the flowers. No one questioned it. No one removed it. And somehow, no one needed to ask who Frank was. They could feel it. In the way the light seemed to fall a little softer in that corner. In the way people slowed down when they passed. One Saturday, a young man named Darius entered the store. His hoodie was pulled tight over his head, his shoulders tense. He looked out of place, eyes darting from shelf to shelf. He wasn't there to shop. He was there because he didn't know where else to go. He passed Frank's bench and paused. Frank looked up and gave him a nod. Not a big smile, not a question, just an invitation. Darius sat down slowly, uncertain. They sat in silence for several minutes. Finally, Darius said, I didn't think anyone would notice me if I walked in here. Frank responded, sometimes we go where we hope someone might. Darius nodded. I lost my brother last year. He used to bring me here after school. This is the only place that feels like it still belongs to him. Frank didn't rush to fill the space. He just placed a hand on the bench and said, then this place belongs to you too. From that day forward, Darius returned every weekend, sometimes to talk, sometimes just to sit. He began volunteering to clean up around the store, tidy the shelves, and organize the ones we've forgotten box. And each time he passed Frank, he'd tap the bench gently, a silent gesture of thanks, of trust, of belonging. Daniel began to understand something profound. This wasn't just about Frank. It was about everyone Frank gave space to. The overlooked, the hurting, the quiet ones who thought their pain was invisible. Frank didn't heal people with speeches. He healed them by staying. And in a world where people are always coming and going, staying became the most radical thing of all. Frank's presence had become such a constant that the store didn't feel complete without him. Staff members would often check the bench first thing in the morning, just to see if he'd already arrived. If he wasn't there, they'd feel a strange emptiness, as if something essential was missing from the rhythm of the day. And when he did arrive, always quietly, always with a gentle nod, everything just seemed to settle into place. One afternoon, a group of schoolchildren entered the store on a field trip. They weren't there for groceries. They were learning about community spaces, kindness, and how people take care of each other. Their teacher led them toward Frank's bench. She had heard stories, read letters online, and wanted them to witness it for themselves. Frank was there, of course, reading a worn paperback novel. When the kids surrounded him, he looked up and smiled. "Well," he said, "what a fine group of visitors." The children had questions, simple ones. Why do people write letters here? Why do you sit here every day? Do you work at the store? Frank answered each with patience and warmth. I sit here because it makes people feel safe. And when people feel safe, they remember what matters. One little girl asked, "But who made it safe for you?" Frank paused, his eyes misty. "A boy did. A long time ago. Now he's a man. And he showed me I still had something left to give." Daniel watched from a distance, hand resting on a display shelf, heart full. He knew what Frank was doing wasn't measurable, not in profits or foot traffic or any business metric, but it was priceless in a different way. The store had become a community, and Frank had become its heart, a living reminder that humanity doesn't have to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes it just has to show up. That evening, after the children had gone and the lights dimmed, Frank remained on the bench. Daniel joined him, handing him a cup of tea. "You made their day," he said. Frank chuckled. "They made mine." Then he turned, more serious. I think we all just want to be remembered. Not for what we had, but for how we made people feel." Daniel nodded slowly. "And you've made more people feel seen than you'll ever know." Time, as it does, kept moving forward. But Frank remained steady, like a lighthouse in the current. New faces came into the store, travelers, relocated families, people who had only heard rumors about the man at the bench near the window. Some arrived skeptical, others curious, but nearly all of them left changed. Not because Frank told them something profound, but because he listened like their story mattered. One morning, Frank wasn't there when the store opened. At first, no one panicked. But by noon, whispers began. "Has anyone seen Frank?" Daniel called his phone. No answer. He sent someone to check the bench in the park nearby. Nothing. By late afternoon, the store had grown unusually quiet. A weight settled in the air. Customers noticed. Regulars asked. The bench, sitting empty by the window, looked wrong, like a chapter left unfinished. Daniel left the store early, heart racing with a dread he couldn't explain. He drove by Frank's apartment, knocked, waited. Finally, an elderly neighbor opened her door and smiled softly. "He's fine, dear. Just a bit tired today. Needed a rest." Relief hit Daniel like a wave. But even more than relief, a deep realization. Frank was getting older. Slower. And the day would come, maybe not now, maybe not soon, but eventually, when the bench would be empty for good. The next morning, Frank returned. A bit more pale, a little less steady, but smiling as always. When he sat down, the entire staff exhaled. Daniel brought him tea without being asked. Customers passed by with warm greetings, many placing notes in the box without making eye contact, almost as if acknowledging something too tender to say aloud. Everyone could feel it. Time was precious. And so was he. Frank looked out the window, sunlight catching in his eyes. "I didn't think they'd notice," he said quietly. Daniel sat beside him. "How could we not?" Frank turned, voice low. Then I'll keep coming. As long as I can. Because maybe what this place really needed was someone who never stopped believing that people can be good, even when the world makes them feel small. Daniel nodded, a lump in his throat. In that day, no one left the store without saying thank you. Frank's absence that one day had done something subtle but lasting. It made everyone more present. Employees no longer rushed through their shifts with headphones in or heads down. Customers spoke more gently, even to strangers. People lingered a little longer, not out of convenience, but out of care. It was as if the store had collectively realized how fragile moments were, how quickly someone who'd always been there might one day not be. Daniel decided to place a small wooden plaque above the bench. It simply read, "This is where kindness sits." Frank tried to wave it off when he saw it. Too much attention, he grumbled with a smile. But the twinkle in his eye betrayed him. Deep down, he was moved, not by the words, but by the truth behind them. Because even if he didn't seek recognition, he understood now. Staying had mattered. Quiet consistency had changed more lives than he could count. That same week, a young woman named Sophia entered the store, holding a newborn in one arm and pushing a cart with the other. She looked exhausted, her coat dusted with dried formula, her eyes red. She barely noticed the bench until Frank smiled at her and said, "Tough day." She exhaled so deeply it sounded like a sob. "Every day," she replied. "I love her, but I'm so tired." Frank didn't offer advice. He just said, "You're doing better than you think. And she already knows you're her hero." Sophia sat with him, tears quietly rolling down her cheeks as she cradled her baby. Later, she wrote a note and dropped it into the ones we've forgotten box. It read, "Today, I was remembered. Not as a mother. Not as a customer. As a person. Thank you, Frank." Daniel read the letter after closing and stood for a long time beside the bench, one hand resting on its wooden back. What had started as a simple act of compassion had become a foundation, a place where people rediscovered their worth. That night, Frank stayed later than usual. He and Daniel sat in silence as the lights dimmed around them. Finally, Frank spoke. "I think the world's just full of people waiting to be told they still matter." Daniel nodded. "And you've made that your mission." Frank chuckled, his voice soft. "No, I just never stopped believing it was true." And in that quiet, the bench by the window didn't feel like a seat anymore. It felt like a beacon. Frank's health began to fade with the seasons. His steps slowed, his hands trembled more, and some days he needed help just getting into the store. But he still came. Even when the air was cold and his joints ached, he showed up, because by then, it wasn't just a bench. It was a promise to be there, to see people, to remind them of what the world had taught them to forget, that they mattered. The staff adapted without ever being asked. Someone always brought him tea. Someone always cleared the space near the bench. They started calling it the first round of the day, preparing Frank's corner before the rest of the store opened. Customers, too, adjusted. If the bench was empty, they left notes or drawings. Some even left food. Little meals wrapped in foil, labeled for Frank. He never took more than he needed, and always with a thank you. One afternoon, Daniel sat beside Frank and asked if he ever thought about stopping. Frank looked out the window, then down at the hands resting in his lap. "Sometimes, but then I remember how many people still need to be seen. If I can sit here a little longer and help even one more, then it's worth it." Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've helped more than you know." Frank smiled. "Then I'll stay, until staying isn't enough." It was that week that a small article appeared in the local newspaper. A customer had written about the bench, about Frank, about what was happening inside that grocery store. "They don't sell just food," the article said. "They give people back their dignity." Within days, letters arrived from out of town. People visited just to sit on the bench. Frank never made a scene. He just nodded, listened, and smiled as if to say, "Welcome home." And in that quiet warmth, something eternal took root. It wasn't about coins, or groceries, or even a tearful reunion. It was about presence. A man who chose not to walk away. A community that followed his example. And a store that learned how to become something more than just a place to shop. It had become a place to heal. As winter settled once more, the bench by the window remained a constant beacon in the heart of the store. The cold outside seemed to press people inward, closer to warmth, to memory, to meaning. And always, there was Frank. Thinner now, a little slower, but present. The light from the window cast soft shadows across his face, and those who approached him often felt as if they were stepping into a space not bound by time. One morning, Daniel arrived to find a small line of people quietly forming by the bench before the store had even opened. He didn't ask why. He knew. These weren't customers. These were souls in need of acknowledgement. Frank, wrapped in a wool scarf and holding a thermos between both hands, smiled at each one. Some sat beside him for a moment. Others simply touched the wood of the bench and moved on. Each left lighter than when they came. Later that afternoon, a boy, maybe 10 or 11, sat beside Frank without saying a word. He held a notebook in his lap and clutched it tightly. After a while, Frank asked, "What are you writing?" The boy shrugged. "Letters. To my dad. He's gone." Frank nodded. "Mine's gone too." The boy looked up, surprised. "Did you write to him?" Frank smiled. "Still do. He doesn't write back, but I feel better anyway." The boy quietly slid his notebook into the ones we've forgotten box and leaned his head on Frank's shoulder. The moment lingered, witnessed only by Daniel and one employee standing at a distance, tears in their eyes. It was these kinds of interactions that could never be tracked, never be photographed, never truly be explained. But they were the moments that mattered most. Because in them, people didn't just remember the ones they'd lost, they remembered themselves. That evening, Daniel stayed behind a lockup. As he turned off the lights, he passed the bench and paused. There, resting on the seat, was a single paper heart, drawn in crayon. On it, in shaky handwriting, "Thank you, Frank. You made my sadness feel safe." Daniel held it for a long time before gently placing it inside the memory box, next to 100 other stories that had found shelter in the presence of one quiet man who never stopped showing up. A soft snow began to fall outside the store as the year crept toward its close. Holiday music played faintly through the speakers, but it was the laughter, the hugs, the knowing glances between strangers that gave the place its soul. Frank's bench, now decorated with handmade ornaments and messages tied with string, had become the heart of it all. Children left cookies, seniors left poems, and in the center, always, Frank. Daniel noticed the subtle shift in Frank's breath that week. He seemed to tire more quickly. He paused more between sentences. He winced now when standing, though he never complained. One morning, Daniel offered to bring him a chair with a cushion, but Frank refused. "This bench is enough," he said. "It's held so many. I can handle its weight a little longer." That Friday, a woman who had been watching Frank all week finally approached. Her name was Elena. Her husband had passed 3 months earlier, and she hadn't stepped into a grocery store since. "I was afraid," she admitted. "Afraid the world had moved on without me. But then I saw you, just sitting here, like there was still a place left in the world where it's okay to hurt a little." Frank took her hand. "It's more than okay," he said. "It's holy." Elena returned every day after that, not to shop, but to sit with Frank. They didn't talk much. Sometimes they just watched the snow together. But each day, Elena smiled a little more, and Daniel realized something beautiful. Frank was no longer carrying the bench alone. Others had begun to sit with him not as people in need, but as companions. The act of witnessing had begun to multiply. By the end of the week, the ones we've forgotten box had to be emptied twice. Not because it was overwhelmed with grief, but because people had begun to use it to remember out loud, to reclaim names, to give their love a place to land. And through it all, Frank remained, gentle, steady, and impossibly present, like a flame that flickered, yes, but never wavered. As the new year dawned, a hush fell over the city, frosted windows, long nights, and the quiet pulse of people trying to begin again. At the store, nothing changed on the surface. Groceries still lined the shelves. Employees stocked and scanned. But underneath it all, there was a reverence. The bench wasn't just part of the layout anymore. It was part of the ritual. A stop for those who carried things they hadn't named. A place to breathe before life asked them to move again. Frank arrived later than usual one morning. His steps slower, his eyes softer. Daniel helped him to the bench without a word, and Frank sat in silence for several minutes, looking out at the street. Finally, he said, "I dreamed last night that the bench was empty, but not lonely. People came and sat down, even though I wasn't there. and they still remembered. Daniel swallowed hard. Maybe the bench learned from you how to keep staying. That day, two teenage boys, loud, restless, wandered in. They weren't there to shop. They scanned the store with skeptical eyes and made a few sarcastic comments about the bench. But Frank didn't flinch. He simply looked at them and said, "You ever lost someone and didn't know how to talk about it?" One of the boys froze. The other looked away. After a long pause, the first one muttered, "My brother." Frank nodded. "Mine too. You can leave his name here if you want. Or just sit." They didn't stay long. But as they left, one of them turned back, pulled a marker from his pocket, and scribbled a name on a paper bag before dropping it in the box. It wasn't a big gesture, but it was true. And Frank had taught everyone that even the smallest act of remembrance carries the weight of something eternal. Later, Daniel wrote a note of his own and slipped it into the box. It read, "To the one who reminded us all how to be human again. We see because you saw us first." And when he looked back across the room, Frank was still there, quiet, watchful, as if waiting not for applause, but for the next soul to quietly arrive with their pain tucked deep in their pocket, ready to be seen. February crept in cold and gray. Outside, the streets were slushy and loud. But inside the store, warmth bloomed in small, persistent ways. A new customer service sign had been placed beside the bench. "Please feel free to sit. No purchase necessary. Just presence." Frank smiled when he saw it. "That's all most people want," he said. "Permission to exist without having to explain why they feel so heavy." That week, a man named Vincent entered the store. He had recently moved to the area and was recovering from a long illness. He didn't know anyone. He rarely left his apartment. But something drew him in. He couldn't say what. When he saw the bench, he paused. Frank looked up, made room, and said nothing. After a few minutes, Vincent whispered, "I used to be a teacher. Before everything fell apart." Frank turned to him. "You still are. Some lessons take longer to finish." Vincent came back the next day, and the next. He started reading poetry aloud beside the bench, softly, barely above a whisper. Shoppers slowed down to listen. A child sat cross-legged on the floor one afternoon, completely still, eyes wide. When her mother came to take her hand, she said, "Not yet." He's still saying something beautiful. And Frank, listening with a hand over his heart, nodded in agreement. The store had become more than a place of commerce. It had become a haven for memory and motion. Some left with groceries. Others left with lighter shoulders. No one who passed through left unchanged. And all the while, Frank remained. Though his breath was shorter and his skin more fragile, his presence only grew stronger. Because presence, when given freely, multiplies beyond the limits of the body. That evening, as the staff closed up, Daniel stood before the bench and took a long, quiet breath. He placed a fresh daisy on the seat, Frank's favorite gesture of gratitude. And for a moment, the entire store fell into the kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but sacred, because something holy had taken root there, and it wasn't leaving. March arrived with its hesitant promise of spring. A little more sun, a little more birdsong, but the cold still clung to the early mornings. Frank's health had clearly begun to decline. His frame, once sturdy in its stillness, now leaned more heavily on the bench. He walked slower, spoke softer, but he still came. Every day, Daniel offered to drive him, even offered to pick up groceries for him so he could rest. But Frank refused with a gentle smile. "If I can still make it here," he said, "then I still have something to give." More people were visiting now than ever before. Some came from towns miles away just to sit at the bench, hoping Frank would be there. Most didn't need a long conversation. They just needed a nod, a glance, a moment. It was as though Frank had become a mirror. People saw their hidden grief, their silent hopes, reflected back in his quiet strength. And in seeing themselves, they began to soften. One afternoon, Daniel noticed a man pacing outside the store. He had passed the entrance several times without coming in. Finally, he stepped through, his shoulders tense, eyes wet. He approached Frank slowly and whispered, "I haven't spoken to anyone in days. I don't even know why I came here." Frank looked up, as if he had been expecting him all along. "Maybe your silence needed to be seen before it became a story again." The man sat down, and for the next hour, neither of them said another word. After he left, Frank took a breath and leaned back against the bench, closing his eyes for a moment. Daniel sat beside him, quiet. "That was beautiful," he said. "You didn't even have to say anything." Frank opened his eyes slowly. Sometimes, healing doesn't need words. It just needs somewhere safe to land. Daniel looked at him, heart aching. "What if people forget when you're gone?" Frank smiled. "They won't. Because I didn't teach them me. I taught them how to see each other." That evening, a little girl left a crayon drawing taped to the bench. It showed two people sitting beneath a tree with hearts in the branches. At the bottom, in large, uneven letters, it read, "Thank you for being the kind part of the world." And that night, Daniel cried, not for what was ending, but for everything that had already been given. April brought rain, gentle at first, then steady. It drummed softly on the windows of the store, filling the aisles with the sound of reflection. Frank still came, wrapped in layers, his breath visible in the cool air. Staff members instinctively moved slower, spoke quieter when he entered. Everyone knew they were witnessing something rare, a soul fully poured out, day by day, with no performance, only purpose. On a particularly wet afternoon, a group of high school students came in for a community service project. They were loud, clumsy, unsure of how to act in the strange, reverent space that had grown up around Frank's bench. But when one of them knocked over a display and muttered a joke, Frank didn't scold. He just smiled and said, "You'll learn. We all do. The world gets louder, but your heart will teach you to listen." The boy paused, then asked, "How will I know I've learned?" Frank replied, "When someone sits beside you and stays." Later that week, Daniel noticed that Frank's hands had grown weaker. He struggled to hold his thermos, and when he wrote, his letters shook. So Daniel quietly installed a small shelf beside the bench, a place for drinks, notes, even drawings. He didn't tell anyone, but the next day, someone left a folded blanket on the bench. The day after that, a basket of mittens and scarves appeared nearby. Without being asked, the community had begun to carry Frank back. It wasn't charity. It wasn't sympathy. It was love, offered the way Frank had taught it, quietly, sincerely, without need for credit. The ones we've forgotten box overflowed with stories. A new notebook had to be added every week. Yet the bench stayed the same, wooden, weathered, simple. Because Frank's presence was never in the bench itself. It was in what it allowed, a space where no one had to be anyone but human. That Sunday evening, as rain tapped gently on the roof and the lights inside flickered warm and soft, Frank leaned his head back and whispered, "It's almost time." Daniel, sitting beside him, felt his throat tighten. "You'll tell me when?" Frank nodded. "When the silence feels full enough." And with that, they sat, two men who had once been strangers, now bound by something deeper than years. By the kind of love that only grows when someone refuses to leave. The following week, something subtle shifted. Frank's bench remained in place. His tea was still poured, and the shelf beside him held fresh flowers each morning. But Frank himself grew quieter. Not absent, just softer. He spoke less, listened more, and often stared out the window, as though he were watching something only he could see. Those who sat beside him noticed it too, not with worry, but with a strange kind of peace, as if something sacred was drawing closer. Daniel noticed that more people were sitting in silence next to Frank, not to ask questions, not to be counseled, but simply to be near him. Children would hand him folded drawings without saying a word. Adults would rest their palms on the edge of the bench and walk away with tears in their eyes. Frank had become more than a man. He had become a memory in motion, a presence you didn't just meet, but carried home with you. One morning, a woman named Ruth, who had sat with Frank many times before, asked if she could read something aloud. Frank nodded. She pulled out a page, her voice trembling. "You said we all want to be remembered, not for what we had, but for how we made people feel." She paused, then smiled through tears. "Well, you made us feel seen, Frank. You made us believe we were still worthy of being noticed, even in our lowest, quietest days." Frank reached out and squeezed her hand. That same evening, Daniel stayed late, walking through the aisles long after the lights had dimmed. When he reached the bench, he found a fresh journal, unopened, with a note taped to the cover. It simply read, "For the ones who come after." Inside, The first entry was written in Frank's neat, shaking hand. Please sit here. And if someone needs to talk, listen with your heart. You don't need to fix them. You just need to stay. Daniel didn't cry right away. He just sat beside the bench, his hand resting on the wood, and whispered, "You've changed this place forever." And though the room was empty, he felt it, that he wasn't alone. Spring bloomed in full. Tulips outside the entrance. Light pouring in through the windows like a blessing. Frank still came, but now he was always accompanied, never alone. Someone always walked with him, helped him sit, made sure his scarf was tucked and his tea was warm. Not because he asked, because people couldn't imagine letting him carry anything alone anymore. He had carried so much for them. Then one day it happened. Quietly, gently, without warning or spectacle. Frank didn't arrive. Daniel waited. Staff members glanced at the door. Customers slowed near the bench. But the seat remained empty, untouched. And by noon, a silence filled the store unlike any before. Not of fear, not of sadness, but of reverence. As if everyone could feel the weight of what was no longer there, and the echoes of all that had been left behind. Later that day, Daniel received a call from Frank's neighbor. He passed in his sleep, she said, peaceful, like he knew it was time. Daniel thanked her, then hung up and sat alone on the bench, heart full of grief, yes, but also of gratitude. Gratitude for the man who had once entered quietly with a handful of coins and had left behind a legacy of presents. Word spread fast, but there were no loud announcements, no printed flyers. People just knew. The next morning, the bench overflowed with flowers, candles, letters, and drawings. Children sang softly. Adults held hands. One man knelt before the bench and wept like a son mourning his father. And every person who passed that spot looked not with pity, but with honor, because they understood something sacred had sat there. And on the window beside the bench, written in soft white ink, someone had scrawled one final message. He stayed. And because he stayed, so will we. In the days that followed Frank's passing, the store did not return to normal, because normal no longer existed. Something had shifted permanently, not just in the walls or the lighting or the layout, but in the people. Everyone moved a little slower, spoke a little softer, looked each other in the eye with a kind of quiet respect that hadn't been there before. It was as if Frank had left behind an invisible thread, one that now wove through every heart that passed through those doors. Daniel placed a small engraved plaque above the bench. It read, "Frank's bench, for the ones who listen, the ones who wait, and the ones who stay." No one touched the bench for a full day. It sat untouched, adorned with fresh daisies and handwritten notes. But the next morning, something beautiful happened. A woman named Nadine, who had sat with Frank many times, took her place quietly on the bench. She didn't speak. She just opened a journal and wrote, "Today, I'll stay," just like he did. And so it began. A rotation, never organized, never scheduled. People began taking turns on Frank's bench, not to impersonate him, but to honor him. One man brought a guitar and played quietly for an hour. A child brought her stuffed rabbit and told it a story, just as she used to do with Frank. Even the staff would pause their routines to sit beside someone in silence, offering nothing but presence. It wasn't a job. It was a calling. The Ones We've Forgotten box was no longer just a place to leave stories. It became an archive, a living collection of love letters to grief, memory, and human connection. Daniel commissioned a local artist to build a small glass case beside the bench, where selected notes could be displayed and rotated weekly. The first entry placed inside was a letter from Frank himself. "To the next person who thinks they're invisible, you're not. Sit here. We see you. We always will." And in this space, born from one man's decision to simply show up with kindness and stay, a tradition had been born. One that didn't need ceremony or instruction, just a heart willing to pause long enough to listen, long enough to matter. And as spring bloomed outside the store, the air inside felt full of something more than loss. It felt full of legacy. Months passed, and still the bench remained filled, sometimes with conversation, other times with sacred silence. The store became known far beyond its neighborhood. Visitors came not for the prices, not for the convenience, but for the bench, for the story, for the spirit of the man who had, with nothing more than consistency and compassion, changed the trajectory of an entire community. Daniel spoke at a local gathering one evening, invited to share what had happened. He didn't bring statistics or charts. He brought the original drawing from the little girl, the one with the tree and hearts in the branches. "This is what he gave us," Daniel said. "He gave us roots. He taught us to stay when it would have been easier to walk away. And now, we stay for each other." Schools began using Frank's story to teach empathy. Counselors placed pictures of the bench in their offices, and slowly, other benches began to appear in libraries, clinics, even malls. Always quiet, always open. Some bore his name. Others simply carried the phrase, "Please sit. You matter." And every time Daniel saw one, he smiled, not out of pride, but out of awe, because one man had become many. Back at the store, a child born the same week Frank passed was now old enough to toddle across the tile floor. Her mother brought her to the bench each week, telling her the story of the man who saw people. "This is where kindness lives," she'd whisper, and the little girl would smile, touch the wood, and press a sticker heart onto the bench like a tiny offering. And Daniel, older now, with lines around his eyes and more gray in his beard, still sat at the bench from time to time, sometimes to listen, sometimes just to remember. One evening, as the sun slipped low and golden across the floor, he placed his hand on the bench and whispered, "You stayed, Frank. And now, so do we." And outside, a breeze stirred the leaves, and the whole world felt like it had paused to listen, just like he taught us to do. Sometimes, the most extraordinary people are the ones who speak the least, ask for nothing, and simply stay. Frank never tried to change the world. He just showed up, day after day, with quiet eyes and open hands. But in doing so, he became a mirror, reflecting back to each of us the parts of ourselves we forget when life gets too loud. He didn't heal with miracles. He healed with presence. And in a world that often rushes past pain, he taught us to pause. This story isn't just about Frank. It's about all of us. It's about the choice to see someone when it would be easier to look away. It's about making space for a stranger's sorrow without needing to fix it. And above all, it's about the kind of love that doesn't demand attention, but that changes everything through consistency. Because kindness, when given without agenda, becomes something sacred, something unforgettable. What started with a refusal to serve an elderly man ended with a community transformed, because one person remembered what it felt like to be seen and chose to pass that on. And maybe that's the lesson that matters most, that the smallest act of acknowledgement can echo longer than a lifetime, that staying is a choice. And when you stay, when you listen, when you believe someone's story matters, you leave behind more than a memory. You leave a legacy. So the next time you pass a stranger, a quiet bench, or someone clutching a handful of coins, pause. Let the world slow down for just a moment. Ask yourself, what would Frank do? The answer won't come in words. It will come in stillness. And in that stillness, you might just hear something the world has been waiting for you to notice. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of someone you once knew, or someone you never got to thank, share your thoughts in the comments. Honor their name. Like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let's fill this space with the kind of presence that Frank gave so freely. Not because we have to, but because staying might be the most powerful thing we can do.